Good morning. Well, welcome everyone to the 2018 Georgia Legislative Policy Forum. For those of you I have not met yet, my name's Kyle Wingfield. I'm the President and CEO of the Georgia Public Policy Foundation, and we are thrilled that you're here with us this morning. We've got a great day planned for you, a lot of really important issues facing our state that we're going to delve into on a deep level, because we'll be here for the better part of the day, we get to cover several of those topics really in depth. And I think if you'll walk away from here today with a much better understanding of the challenges our state faces, but also the opportunities we have to solve them. The theme for today, of course, is wisdom, justice, and responsibility. We like to play on that motto of the state, wisdom, justice, and moderation each year. And this year we want to talk about the responsible ways that Georgia can tackle challenges in criminal justice, in health care, in pensions, and in education. To get started this morning, we want to acknowledge and thank our sponsors, without whom this would not be possible. Our presenting sponsor is the Walton Family Foundation. Our platinum sponsor is Verizon. Our gold sponsors are the Georgia Charter Schools Association and Georgia Power. Our silver sponsors are Georgia EMC, Oglethorpe Power, and Georgia Transmission. Our bronze sponsors are General Building Maintenance, the Georgia Motor Trucking Association, the Heartland Institute, and the United Way of Greater Atlanta. Please join me in thanking our sponsors with a round of applause. Now, as I said, we're going to cover a lot of ground today and get into some really good discussions about a number of topics. The very first one we're going to tackle is one that the Georgia Public Policy Foundation has been talking about for over 10 years, and that is reforming our criminal justice system. This is one of the really bright spots in Georgia over the past 7 to 8 years under the leadership of Governor Nathan Deal. And to hear more about our speaker this morning, I'd like to invite up Marissa McCall Dodson. She is the Public Policy Director for the Southern Center for Human Rights, which is a great partner of ours in this work on criminal justice reform. I appreciate Marissa and her organization because I don't know if a lot of people right off the bat would put our organizations together as likely to work on an issue, but I think it shows what both of us, where our hearts are and our willingness to reach out and find any partners who are willing to work on an issue in the right way. And so, Marissa, thank you for your partnership over the years, and thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, Kyle. Good morning. So first, forgive my voice, and it's a little scratchy. I have a cold, but I'm working through it. Good morning. Again, my name is Marissa Dodson. I'm the Public Policy Director at the Southern Center for Human Rights, and I have the esteemed privilege this morning of introducing the summit's keynote speaker. But this is a man who doesn't really need an introduction. He is known around the country as being the charismatic, preacher-like, bow tie, dapper bow tie wearing judge who reformed his juvenile justice system in Clayton County to address the school to prison pipeline before people were even talking about the school to prison pipeline. To that point, if there's one thing that has become increasingly more obvious over the last 10 to 15 years, it's that harsh, punitive, excessive punishments don't work. They're a waste of taxpayer dollars. They don't make us more safe. And so, like I mentioned, even before states like Georgia and Texas came to this recognition that we need to be doing something different, Judge Teske was the leader in Georgia and around the country, identifying problems in juvenile justice and addressing them head on. In the 1990s, there started a policy called zero tolerance. And what zero tolerance policies were was for any number of offenses, regardless of the circumstances, kids were removed from the schools. It was forcing kids to be arrested and putting them into the criminal justice system in overwhelming ways. This was supposed to be a deterrent. It was supposed to find some ways to keep the bad apples out of schools, but it really wasn't working. And Judge Teske, after spending a few years on the bench, recognized that it wasn't working to just be putting kids out of school with the hope that that was going to be improving our community. He saw that it wasn't working for the children, it wasn't working for their families, and it wasn't working for the community. So in 2004, knowing that the school arrests had risen between 1994 and 2003 by 95%, Judge Teske said, we have to do something differently. Just like Governor Deal did when he took office in 2010, Governor Deal, who was also a juvenile court judge, like Judge Teske, recognized that the real way that you look into a problem is to bring folks together who know a little bit about it. So what he did was look at data, evidence-based practices, to figure out what's happening in these schools and how can we keep kids on the right track to living successful lives. He put together teachers, he put together police officers, he put together social services and mental health service providers. He thought about parents and community activists, brought people together in a room, looked at the data, looked at the evidence, and was able to put together what is now referred to as the Teske approach, thinking about ways to keep kids in school, do everything we can to prevent school dropouts, to give children what they need around mental health and services to their families, and that program saw tremendous results. What we know, just for example, is that since 2004, when this program started, we have seen reductions in Clayton County school arrests, overwhelming reductions in the arrests in Clayton County. In fact, when you're talking about serious violent offenses or serious gun offenses, in schools, in Clayton County, the numbers dropped by 80%, while graduation rates in Clayton County went up by 20% during this time. And like I said, this approach, known as the Teske model, is now taken across the country. Judge Teske is known as a national expert. He's asked to come into jurisdictions and talk about what's working in Clayton County, how he has seen a change in the community that he serves. I could go on and on about his associations and the awards that Judge Teske has won, but I won't. What I'll give you is a few of his accolades and tell you that he is still, not only is he known as a leader in Georgia, as I mentioned, but he is giving his time to agencies and organizations around the country that are vying and dying for these kinds of strategies that can be effective and, again, save taxpayer dollars. He's a past president of the Georgia Council of Juvenile Court Judges and the Clayton County Bar Association. He is the national chair of the Coalition for Juvenile Justice and has served on the board of directors for the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. He also finds time to be an adjunct professor at John Marshall Law School. I don't know how you do that. He has testified twice before Congress, all around the country. It's with state legislatures. He has served 2 terms on the Federal Advisory Committee for Juvenile Justice. He has written articles and been published nationally. As I mentioned, there's this connection between he and Governor Deal. In 2012, Governor Deal appoints him to sit at that same type of table, that stakeholders that knows a little bit about what's happening, to put together some reforms around juvenile justice that could do exactly at the state level what Judge Teske had realized how to do at the county level. Because of Judge Teske's leadership on the Council for Criminal Justice Reform, he served through the council's sunset earlier this summer. But because of his leadership, we are now seeing changes to the numbers of kids that are being sent out of home and costing, again, families and communities countless dollars and resources. We know, for example, that commitments of youth to out-of-home placements have reduced by 40% since implementing the changes to the juvenile code. We know that the youth incarcerated population has declined by almost half in the same time frame. So again, we are finding ways to keep kids in homes, and it is because of the leadership of Judge Teske. The last thing I'll say to you is a little bit of a tidbit I didn't know, is that Judge Teske is a triple Panther. He received his bachelor's, master's, and law degree from Georgia State University. I could not think of a better person to talk to you today about criminal justice reforms that are responsible and meaningful and are changing people's lives than Judge Teske. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome to the stage at this time, Judge Teske.
Good morning, everyone. Let's see, how does this PowerPoint work? Do I have a clicker? Does someone do it for me? I saw Kyle up here and is automatically going. Is this it? Okay, very good. Thank you. Technology, that's the one thing that confuses me, okay? And the other thing, too, I'm not married to a podium, all right? I don't like that, so I asked for a lavalier so I can move around. So I'm gonna get closer to you. If that's okay, Kyle, can I come down? All right, very good. All right, you know, I titled this morning's keynote, The Politics of Reform. And I say that because reform is not that simple. Traditionally, when reform is done on, let's say, a statewide basis, it tends to be a response to some tragedy or event. And we all get together, we want to fix it. You legislators out there, you drop, your bill and you work on it. It goes through committee. Maybe it goes into a commission, gets studied. The thing is about reform is that historically we do it, we get it passed, it's over. We walk away. And in many reforms in the past, we never really continue an effort of looking at what we've done in the past. And the difference about reform today, particularly in criminal justice, and how Georgia leads the rest of the states and puts us on the cutting edge, is that Governor Deal asked the legislature, and if it were not for the legislators that we have in Georgia who saw fit and had the foresight to understand the logic in this, to create a commission rather than going year to year on a governor's executive order, so that there's some stability and continuity in looking at what we've done in the past, because when you do real reform and you make changes, and as you operationalize those changes, you begin to turn over stones and uncover things you didn't see that at the time that you were doing reform in that particular year. Particularly in a subject like this, when it deals with modifying behavior, particularly behavior of folks who have a propensity to commit crimes, who have what we call in my business criminogenic needs. Those are crime-producing needs. So I want to begin with kind of that global picture of what it looks like, okay? But our goals back in 2012, when Governor Deal brought us together, and in fact, Marissa did a great job describing the approach, which is an interbranch, multidisciplinary approach. Because I am convinced that in the algorithm for recidivist reduction, one of the factors is collaboration. You will not accomplish effective, true, considerable recidivist reduction unless you have everybody at the table. All three branches, and in the private sector, you have those that are doing that work and they're already doing it well. So in 2012, these were our goals. Develop fiscally sound, data-driven juvenile justice policies that ensure Georgia's tax dollars are used effectively and efficiently. I'm going to be frank with you. And that's one thing about being a judge, I can be frank, okay? Because we're used to being frank. Of course, I'm not in my courtroom, and I'm not wearing the robe, so I don't have absolute immunity, okay? However, all right, I think it's important that you understand that when we do this, we got to be careful to avoid just simply being stupid. And I'm going to tell you, on both sides of the ideological spectrum, you have those extremists, okay? And whether you're on the liberal side or conservative side, there's going to be those pockets of stupidity on both sides. All right? There is. Now, some of them you can help them and get them to understand, best practices and what works. There are some that you just can't because, well, they're just dysfunctional. That's it. I know how else to put it, okay? There's some personality disorder. I don't know what you want to call it. I just don't have time to diagnose them. I'm not qualified to diagnose them. So we got to figure out a system that we can move forward, all right, without creating obstacles or having people put insurmountable obstacles in front of us. And I will tell you right there, there are those who just want to throw money at this problem, when you don't have to throw money at the problem. We already have money. The problem is what we were doing in 2012, and thank you legislators out there, okay, who understand this fundamental principle that we need to take a look first at what we're already doing before we start coming with ideas about how to fix something. And so that's what we did. The governor brought in the Pew Charitable Trust folks with all their researchers. We did a data dumping, and we got a profile of what our kids look like that were in the system. It's like what I tell schools. I've been in 41 states. This year I've been working with New Orleans and Las Vegas, and they both have signed what Marissa described is the Teske approach, the school justice partnership. And there's now all over the country, New York City, Los Angeles, the first and second largest school districts in the country. And, in all those jurisdictions, that's the first thing that I have to help people understand and overcome, is that you can do good things and you don't have to throw money at it. And so when we were looking at this, that's what we found is that let's put it this way. When I tell schools, hey, superintendent, what's your major goal? Because I already know there's two of them. Number one, keep schools safe. Number two, graduate kids. Well, let's focus about graduating kids for a moment. All right? So how do you graduate more kids than what you have graduating now? It's very simple. Take a look at the kids who are not graduating. What do they look like? And you already have the data of the kids who are not graduating. All you got to do is look in the past and see who did not graduate and what do they look like. Because once you determine what they look like, you are in a better position to come up with what type of modalities you need at what point in their educational life, which is going to be as early as possible in elementary school, to try to get them on a trajectory to graduate and not be so much at risk at dropping out later when they get into high school. The same principle here in juvenile justice reform. We found out that 40% of the kids that we were sending to secure confinement to our YDCs, let's just face it, they're youth prisons. Okay? They have razor wire fences. All right? They have cell blocks. All right? They're youth prisons. That 40% of them were low-risk kids. They were not public safety problems. They were kids who made us mad, as opposed to the kids who scared us. I call them POA kids. Excuse my language. Piss off adult kids. Okay? All right? Now, I don't want to blame judges now. It's not just because I'm a judge. Okay? But it's what I call default judgment. And I don't mean the same type of default judgment in a civil case. I'm talking about when it comes to disposition and a judge is facing looking at this kid who's just being a harassing kid in the community, just over and over and over, and doesn't know what to do with the kid anymore. And the people in the community are there in the courtroom saying, Judge, you got to do something with this kid because, you got to notify victims. Victims have a right to be there. I'm a big victim advocate. That's a whole nother subject I can talk about. I like my victims to be there because they help me rehabilitate the kid. There's nothing better that a kid needs to be rehabilitated than to put a face on the person they hurt and let that person talk to them. Let that kid see that person cry and break down and talk about how I have to put burglar bars on my window now, that I have nightmares at night. We need to help kids understand that and learn empathy. Put these kids in the shoes of the victim. But you know what? What we were doing is why our recidivist rates were so high is that we were making those kids worse. We were taking kids who are our POA kids, the kids who scare us, make us mad, and we were turning them, by the time they got out of that prison, into kids who scare us. That's why we were not making headway, okay? Because that's what the evidence, long time evidence, by the way, okay? It's been around for a long time. One of the times I testified for Congress, I had a congressman from Virginia during the Q&A said, well, Judge Teske, all these evidence-based practices you're talking about, how can I take them back to where do I get them? How do I find out about them? How do I tell people back in my community? I said, Congressman, I don't mean to disrespect or embarrass you, but all you got to do is Google it. If you Google what works in community corrections, you'll get a plethora of all the evidence over the many years of programs in the community that work with high-risk people, high-risk youth, to reduce their risk of reoffending at a cost of $5,000 to $8,000 a year, as opposed to the kids that we were sending to our YDCs at $91,000 a year. $91,000 a year. So 40% of those kids we could have kept in the community had we had the money, right? But the judges had this default judgment because they didn't have the money, because they didn't have the programs. They did not have cognitive restructuring, the 7 challenge, the most effective for drug treatment, moral recognition therapy, okay, life skills training. They didn't have these things. We didn't have these things. So by default, these were the kids that we could have kept in the community, but we committed them. And we made them worse. Okay. Focus on those offenders who are adjudicated delinquent and sent to an out-of-home placement, and identify reforms to current dispositional practices that improve public safety and control costs through more effective use, which I just described. Okay? Now, to understand why, Marissa kind of really laid it down for me. And we didn't even talk before this, by the way. In fact, when she came to me, I apologized I didn't run my introduction by you. I said, you don't have to do that, Marissa. Sounds like she did, though, because to understand, I think, where we are in juvenile justice reform right now, because we're really 4 years into it, because what the legislature passed, based on the recommendations to the governor, and the governor looked at it, and then, gave it to the legislature, and y'all vetted it, okay? It went into effect January 1st of 2014, right? So we're kind of 4 years in it, which is not bad. When you start getting beyond 3 years, you're going to start seeing the picture, the real picture. Because we made a decision on the Criminal Justice Reform Commission that we were going to measure recidivism differently. We're going to be more transparent. We're not going to do this 1-2 year type of thing. We're going to wait longer. We want to track these kids over a longer period of time to see whether or not what we're doing with them is truly attaching and making a difference. Okay? All right? But I want to start off with Clayton County for a moment. Because like Marissa said, the baseline year for us in Clayton County is 2002. It was in 2003 that I brought in this overwhelming change in Clayton County because it got so bad in Clayton County. Everyone knows Clayton County. It's the armpit of Atlanta. That's what we're called, okay? And I will tell you, there was a time that was true. I mean, there were drive-by shootings almost every week. Krista Williams, I'll never forget her being killed at her own birthday party, okay, in a drive-by shooting. The crime rates were the highest in the metro Atlanta area at that time, okay, during that decade. We looked at our data. Juvenile crime was skyrocketing. We were arresting kids, and this was our response. Our response was that we were going to arrest our way out of the problem. That's exactly what we did. Our RYDC, which has a 60-bed facility, there were days we had more than 100 kids in that facility sleeping on mattresses, sleeping on the floors, okay? A lot of them were coming from the school system on misdemeanor offenses. When we broke down back in 2002, when we took a look at the school offenses, and actually it was a 1,200% increase. Whoa. It went from 49 the year before we put school resource officers to 1,400, okay, by 2003. 1,400. And 92% of those offenses that we arrested kids on were misdemeanor offenses. They were not even felonies. 92%. And the bulk of them were disorderly conduct, disrupting public school, and school fights. And I will have to tell you that when I was in middle school, I was guilty of a couple of those things myself. Okay? All right? And no one was going to tell me I wasn't going to beat up another kid who was picking on my sister. All right? I'm sorry, that's just the way I was. Okay? I was the big brother. So let me talk about, real quick, before reform, we had a shift in demographics, increase in number of families in poverty. Graduations fell to an all-time low of 58%, 2003. Okay? I mean, more kids we were arresting, that affected them, dropping out of school. Juvenile and adult crime rates increase. So what we did and how, basically using evidence-based solutions back then, improving outcomes, brought a lot of folks in. I created a local collaborative, just exactly what Governor Deal did with his executive order, creating initially the Criminal Justice Reform Council, and what he asked you legislators to do, in 2012 or 13 to create the Criminal Justice Reform Commission, this interbranch, because it's effective. You got to have all the talking heads who know what they're talking about on this subject at the table, working together, figuring it out. So here's what we know, and this is what I presented in Washington at the National Academy of Sciences. We were talking about the health field wanted to know from the criminal justice reform side how they can reform health, where's Kelly McCutcheon? Are you in here, Kelly? Okay, because that's exactly what Kelly is working on right now. And you can't see it from here. My God, I can't see it. Reduce detention of low-risk youth. Stop arresting the kids, okay, who make us mad. Do something else with them. Most kids who commit delinquent acts age out of their delinquency. I was one of them, okay? All right? Number two, you want to develop safe alternatives. You want to target the high risk. You want to spend taxpayer dollar on the kids who scare us. If you want to increase public safety, that's where you need to spend your money. Don't waste it on kids who are likely never going to commit a serious offense and hurt somebody else and will end up aging out of it and do pretty well, okay? They're going to do well, all right? I mean, they may not end up being a CEO of a big corporate Fortune 500 company, but they're going to do well, all right? And you want to deliver it through a collaborative system, and that's how you reduce crime in your community, all right? So for us, we said, okay, we got to figure out we got to identify what kids really do need to be locked up and need to be held pending trial or disposition or need to be committed. So we were the first court to create and implement what's called the Detention Assessment Instrument, what is now mandated by state law today to help. It's a guideline. It's just a guideline. Let's not misunderstand it. People call it a point system, Yeah, it's a point system, but it doesn't mandate you have to do what the points say. There's discretion in it. We cannot remove what we know intuitively from our experience as well. So it's included in that document. In fact, if you turn it around, it has aggravating, mitigating factors. It engages the intake officer or the judge to be thinking, okay, here's the score, but do I need to move the score up? Do I need to move the score down? It can go either way. Okay, and we call those overrides. And that's very, very important in a couple of ways. Number one, I've already mentioned, so that we're not locking up the wrong kid and we're going to make the kid worse, but we want to make sure that we have an equitable system, particularly around race and ethnicity, that we're not locking up kids of color, okay, as a result of what's called implicit bias. And I want to tell you something, folks. Racism and implicit bias are two different things. Whatever you, don't let anyone, and please, I don't have time to get into this right now. Again, that's a whole nother subject, okay? Implicit bias operates differently because implicit bias is something that is implicit, that we all possess in some shape, form, or fashion, but it's completely different than racism. You can have an implicit bias, and you're not a racist, okay? It's called the attribution theory. It's when we attribute our personal values and beliefs when we make a judgment or a call on somebody else and what they did, all right? So we had to reduce the emissions. So here's our baseline year 2002, and you can see our total emissions, how they've gone down in our RYDC significantly. Now, I'm going somewhere, because you see, it's not just about reducing detention. It's not about reducing commitments. You know, you can't rest your laurels and be proud and beat your breast and say, hey, look what I've done. I've reduced the number of kids going to detention. I've reduced the number of kids that have been committed. I've reduced the number of kids arrested on school campus, and then stop there. Well, so what? What does that mean? Because if I stop right there, it begs the question. Because for some people out there, it's going to sound like, oh, my God, you're just soft on crime. It must be chaotic for you if you don't have the rest of the conversation. So let's have the rest of the conversation and then move and close in on statewide reform. That's our average daily population. By the way, our average daily population now, as you can see, it was at 62 at our Clayton County RYDC, and now it is at 13. That's right. The average daily population in the Clayton County is actually the Martha K. Glaze now. The Clayton County, and the reason I asked the legislature to change it to Martha K. Glaze, because it took, it's a state building, right, to do it, because people were thinking that because it says Clayton RYDC that only Clayton kids are housed there. Well, at one time they were, because we were arresting so many of them. It filled up the beds because it was in our county, right? Well, now there's only 13. Most of the kids that are at the RYDC in Clayton County are kids from other counties, okay? All right? So, the impact on commitments, you can see that they're down. Now, impact on filings. This is the school offense stuff. We have reduced arrest of kids on campus by 95%, okay? She's right. Graduation rates have gone up. During the what's called overall years, when we started this before 2012, the feds required, Department of Education required that school systems reported graduation rates based on what's called the overall formula. In other words, if you started the 9th grade and it took you 6 or 7 years to graduate, you got to count the kid. But in 2012, the Fed said, no, we're not going to do it. That's not transparent. We need a more accurate picture. We need to know better, how well we're serving the kids. You need to know how well you're serving the kids. How many of them, now you can only report the kids who graduate on time. We call it on-time graduation rates, or also called the adjusted 4-year cohort. You start in the 9th grade, you only get to count the kids who graduated 4 years later. Okay? They didn't skip a grade. They didn't fail a grade. All right? That meant every school system's graduation rate across the country went down. Okay? All right? In the overall, our graduation rates went up 24%. Since 2012, our graduation rates have gone up nearly 20%. We have more kids as we track them past graduation who are on a career path, in college, okay, or have a job and are working. I have kids who were once charges adults on armed robbery with a firearm. One is now a supervisor at a Walmart warehouse. And by the way, his crime was a carjacking at a Walmart parking lot. How ironic is that? Now, but I want to tell you, it doesn't work with everyone. I'm going to be frank with you. As many kids as I don't detain, there are some kids I just have to send away because they really do scare the hell out of me. Okay? Because public safety is number one. We have to be smart. That's the politics of this. We have to be smart. That's the thing on the Criminal Justice Reform Council. We cannot ask legislators to do something that looks soft on crime, though we know it works, and not give them something like the data, the research. So we had a commitment. Our commitment was we were not going to send anything to the legislature unless it was supported in research. Hard evidence, okay? Our delinquent filings in Clayton County are down 75%. Down 75%. But you know what the true picture is? Don't measure how well you're doing with kids by the misdemeanors, because kids commit misdemeanors. They're neurologically wired to do stupid things, okay, right? The last one, I don't know if I can, yeah, here we go. See at the bottom, our felonies are down 45%. Our residential burglaries committed by kids are down 62%. Why do you want to look at those? Because police don't turn their backs on felonies. They will on misdemeanors, but not felonies. So when you want to measure juvenile crime, look at the felonies. That's going to give you a true picture of public safety. Now, I got to wind this down. The taxpayer, second chance program. These are high-risk youth. I went to the commissioner back in 2010. I said, it's costing you this $91,000 a year to house a kid. These are the DF kids who've committed a designated felony. I have this intensive program, but to do it, I have to watch them every day. I need them on a GPS monitor for the first 6 months. If you give it to me, I'm going to save you money because I won't give them to you. And he did it. And so I have kids on this. Get this. Here's the bottom line. 65% of the kids who we send to a secure facility recidivate within 3 years. These are kids, had I sent, and I've now graduated 72 kids from this program who were going to go to a secure facility, all right? 65% of them would have reoffended within 3 years of getting out. The recidivist rate among them is 13%. That is when I factor in the 13% that recidivated, I have now saved the taxpayers at the most $21.4 million if they all got the maximum term, or if they all got the minimum term of 1 year, I saved the state $4.3 million just from one county alone. Just from one county alone. So, real quick, state reform. Let me go ahead. Y'all know the process. Marissa actually did a good job. I've already talked about the workgroup findings. We see how many breakdown by race, what was happening in Georgia being removed from the community. We had an overwhelming disproportionate number of kids of color that were going into the system. And even among them, we're talking about 40% of them were low-risk kids. They were not public safety risk, okay? Here's what I want to end with. We see that there's a 36% reduction in secure confinement, 11% reduction in secure detention, which is the RYDCs, a 46% reduction in overall commitments to the Department of Juvenile Justice, a 2% increase in child population during this period of time. So even though we've had an increase in the targeted population, we have this decrease. Why is it done? Because of what the legislature has done in supporting and understanding juvenile justice reinvestment. People, this is where we save the money. All we did is we just took the money we already had by cutting out the kids that we no longer have to house. We take that money and reinvest it. Y'all give me $750,000 a year in Clayton County. And you didn't have to raise taxes to do it. It was already in your budget. And now, those monies are going to evidence-based programs I didn't have before, thanks to y'all. in the legislature, okay? So let me end there because we need to move on and stay on schedule and conclude with this one remark, and I'll turn it over to Kyle. And it's this. My father taught me a long time ago when we were sitting around in his backyard after a cookout. We were at his house, and we went out to the gazebo, and we had our after-dinner bourbon, okay? And maybe that's what stimulated our conversation. And he said, son, what are you doing these days? And I was telling him about all this stuff we're doing, you know. And he told me, he said, you know, and you got to understand, my dad retired from CDC. He was in epidemiology. He said, well, son, that's not much different than what I did in epidemiology. So he told me about the epidemiology model, about in studying diseases and prevention of diseases. He said, what we do is we identify the populations that are at risk. And we study them real hard to get to know what is it about that population that makes them susceptible to this particular disease, whatever it may be. And once we are there, we're halfway to solving the problem because now we can figure out what the treatment modalities are needed for that particular population. And he told me two basic principles that I have now applied in criminal justice reform. He said, son, I'm not saying that disruptive behaviors and delinquent behaviors are diseases. That's not what I'm saying, but they behave like diseases. He says, son, diseases don't occur by chance. Diseases, okay, are not randomly distributed. There are determinants that cause them to be distributed in a certain way. You have to understand those determinants. You got to figure them out. He said, all you need to do, son, is take diseases, remove it, and substitute it with the word disruptive behaviors or delinquent behaviors. They don't occur by chance. They're not randomly distributed. You have to develop a system that stops treating the symptom and look for the cause and start treating the cause. You have to get underneath it. And those are the criminogenic needs. There are 8 criminogenic needs that causes juvenile delinquency. We know what they are. And that's what you have done in the legislature by giving us money on programs that target specifically those criminogenic needs so we don't waste the taxpayers' money. Kyle.
Thank you so much for that. That was a really great way to start our day with that talk. We do want to have a little time for questions from the audience, and I failed to mention earlier that the way we're going to do this throughout the day is you have note cards in the folders that you got at registration. If you'll write your question on the note card, we will take those that way and get them to the speaker on the stage. That's how we're going to do it all day long. So while people act on that information I just gave them and should have given them a while back, let me ask the first question to buy some time here. So you talked a great deal about what's been done, and you talked about the evidence-based or the evidence basis for that. As we go forward, I know one thing that we at the foundation support is we hope that the next governor will reauthorize the Criminal Justice Reform Council because it's been such a great tool for bringing these ideas, vetting these ideas, and putting them in front of the legislature in a way that they can further vet and then act on. If the next governor were to do that, based on what has been done and what we know from the evidence, what are the couple things that you would think that council ought to move on first if it were reconstituted?
That's a good question. And let me just lay a really brief foundation. First of all, I would urge the next governor to please consider seriously reconstituting, asking the legislature to do that. I would even go one step further and ask the legislature maybe to do it in such a way that instead of it being a commission that is sunsetted in the future, okay, but maybe one that is permanently affixed to a particular type of an agency that That maybe one that's what they do for a living, is that they do audits and so you create this inner branch. It's a division of maybe a state agency. What's the agency that does audits for that? I can't remember this. There we go, State Department of Audits. I don't know, I'm just throwing this off the top of my head, okay? The second thing, Kyle, about that, I've also heard people say, God, I'm sick and tired of hearing the word reform. Reform this, reform that, and there really is something about that. I get it, okay? And me being, if I were to describe where I am on the ideological spectrum, I am a moderate conservative, okay? I'm a moderate conservative. That over time, that word reform, for my fellow conservative friends can rub because it sounds a little too liberal, and I don't know if I can live with that, and we have to understand that's part of the politics of reform, okay? We got to help each other out. What's great about collaboration is when you get everybody from both sides of the aisle, whether it's political or ideological, and you bring them all together, part of the collaboration is we get to understand each other and what we need to help the other in order to survive and stay alive, okay? And we have to be willing to compromise, okay? That's part of living together. It's, frankly, the old adage, scratch each other's back. So you may want to replace the word reform with something else. But you do reform. You just don't call it reform, okay? Now, directly to his question about the future, I want to say this. There were some things that when I went on the Criminal Justice Reform Council, I wanted to have done. But I couldn't ask it because it wasn't politically palatable to ask y'all to consider it. Because it's too early in the game to go that far. Because there was too much other good business that needed to happen. Like, for example, stop wasting taxpayer money on programs that don't work. And get a quick, outcome with an $85 million tax saving, okay? With what I just talked about. If the Criminal Justice Reform Commission had gone into other areas that we know don't work, like there are some of the, and I may be selfish about this as a juvenile court judge, but there are some of the 11 deadly sins that we could consider returning back to juvenile court jurisdiction, because there's a number of those that end up getting transferred anyway. We arrest them, they go, treated as an adult, but because of the services in the juvenile court, that they can get in a secure facility, okay, that many of the district attorneys are transferring them to the juvenile court anyway, okay? So do we want to waste our money and resources going through a process that's going to end up over here anyway? So that's one of the things that y'all may look at. But back then, no, that would be asking our legislature to take on something that they couldn't go back to their constituents and accept it and get them to swallow it. That's part of the scratch your back, my back, your back type of thing. There are some things I would like to see happen, but I couldn't ask y'all to do that. It's just not politically palatable. There are some things we have to sacrifice to get other good things done. It's just the way it is. That's the nature of our democratic system. It's just it, okay? Because we, at the end of the day, have to be held accountable by the people who vote for us. And we have to help them. And sometimes it takes time to help our voter base to understand what works. We don't need to be pushing it down anyone's throat until they're ready to take a bite out of it, okay? So that's one of the areas I think now that we've been doing it for so long, we should do a study on that and take a look at which one of those, maybe need to be handled a little bit, differently. And maybe put in conditions at the juvenile court if you do return 2 or 3 of those to the juvenile court for jurisdiction. What is it? I'm going to tell you something about judicial discretion. Don't ever let a judge complain to you about discretion. Don't ever forget, you, the legislators, decide what discretion I get. Okay? It doesn't start with a judge. You are the policymakers. You decide our discretion. Yes, we need to have discretion. You have to decide how far should our discretion go, though. And you have to look at the evidence on that, all right? So that's one. The other one, this is a tough one, folks. And again, we couldn't take it up. We couldn't do this. Is raising the age to 18. We have, North Carolina has just passed the bill last year. Their adult age of criminality was 16. They've now raised it to age 18, but they're doing it incrementally. You know, you heard Marissa say I have a degree in my master's in public administration. I'm a certified public manager as well, okay? Well, one of the things that we've learned is what's called the incremental approach is the best approach when you're dealing with an unknown amount of money that's going to cost taxpayers, okay? Then do it incrementally. And then do it incrementally. You don't go to the next step till you're ready to go to the next step. What does it look like? We have to be smart about it. Yes, Kyle.
Great. We have about 2 minutes left, so I'm going to do my best to combine a few of
Then
these.
I will make sure I give brief answers as my lawyers do briefs too, you know. Though there's never such thing as a true brief, is there? Lawyers in the room.
I'll combine a few of these into one question as best I can so that we're getting as many people's issues addressed as possible. But I want to let you know the questions that we don't use now and throughout the day, please send them even if you see us not using all of them, because we can take those, see where there's some interest out there, and we can design further programming or research at the foundation on that. So the question, I think this gets to the epidemiology part that you were talking about at the end of your prepared remarks, but the questions are about root causes before kids are getting into the interacting with the criminal justice reform. What are some of them? Is mental health one of them? Mm-hmm. And what can be done to intervene and prevent kids from getting there before we even get to these kind of measures?
That's a great question. Yes, we need to start as early as possible. And I call it an early warning system. If we somehow, as let's say policymakers at the statewide level, okay, can at least motivate communities and maybe even incentivize communities to create an early warning system. An example of that would be back in 2010, what also helped us to increase our graduation rates, especially on-time graduation rates, is that we decided to target the chronically disruptive kids. What we found out, we did the ACEs survey on the kids who were chronically disruptive. So because we're part of this collaborative, we sent the mental health folks in. We identified chronically disruptive kids, the kids who were at risk of dropping out of school and committing a delinquent act, okay? What we found out is 87% of that population suffer chronic trauma, adverse childhood experiences. Most of them are poor. Most of the kids who drop out of school come from your impoverished communities. Those are the ones that tend to also be driving the crime, okay? So if we already know where most of the problems are, that's where we need to be fixing our resources and identifying why are they doing this. And a lot of it has to do with the living conditions, home insecurity, food insecurity, clothing insecurity, all the insecurities you can name, okay? They're having to deal with it. These kids are bringing this stuff to school. Johnny doesn't come to school and say, hey, guess what, Mr. Jones? My mama got beat up last night by her live-in boyfriend. See, they don't share that stuff. Jane doesn't come to school and say, hey, Miss Jones, guess what? You know, my mom's live-in boyfriend is raping me every week. And my mama doesn't believe me. These are real stories, okay? These kids don't tell you. You know how they tell us? By their behavior. They're angry. And see, what happens is that these kids, their behavior becomes their language. They are talking to us. We just have to learn to listen. We have to develop a system to listen to them. And so what we did is that in 2010, I called for the building of a nonprofit. It's called the Clayton County System of Care that targets chronically disruptive kids. And to move them into elementary school, into kindergarten, so we can start identifying those kids as early as entering school in kindergarten and getting mental health clinical services. These are the kids that need clinical services. The other stuff, restorative practices, are not going to work with them. They're going to keep reoffending, okay? They're going to keep acting out. And we have to get into their homes. And that's where the juvenile, so we have a system that if we have parents that won't cooperate, when y'all helped Governor Deal pass a law called the Parental Accountability Act, okay? Well, Governor Deal asked me to propose that bill. So I did all the research, put it all together. It got vetted by, several folks in Reform Council, and then sent it to y'all. Y'all passed it. Well, in that bill, what you added to it is that a community-based risk reduction program that's sanctioned by a juvenile court judge can now directly file a petition to the juvenile court without having to file a delinquent, a chins, or dependency action, just to get an order to hold a parent accountable by making that parent cooperate. We now have a stronger system that's based on positivism, not just punitive. Okay? So now we can get into these homes where they need to be treated because we have to treat the entire family. And so that's what we're doing. What we found out now over the last 8 years that the kids who've gone through this program, we are now gone through like the third or whatever cohort year, and these kids are graduating. These are the kids that were not going to graduate, okay? And one last thing, okay, is that as we continue to measure them, their disciplinary referrals are down 87%. You see, kids don't learn if they're disruptive. And other kids aren't going to learn when they're disruptive. So that's why we have to target those behaviors. So that's an excellent question. We have to do more than react. We have to prevent, which is the other thing the juvenile justice reform did that y'all helped us do. If you look at the juvenile code today, it has the word collaboration and collaborate in it that it wasn't there before. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Judge Teske. You're such a wealth of information on this, and I wish we could go even longer. I know there were many questions we could not get to, but I really want to thank you for your participation today. If everyone could join me in one more round of applause.
I have to leave. I have to catch a plane to Washington, D.C., because I've been asked to sit on a focus group for President Trump's most recent appointee to the Administrative Office of Juvenile Justice. For some reason, she thinks I could help her, so I'm spending the afternoon with her today. So anyway, I'm sorry I have to leave, okay? So goodbye, and I'll give you my lavalier. All right?
Thank you very much. We're going to take a 3-minute break to get the stage reset for the next panel, and we'll be right back with the beginning of our healthcare segment.